Everyone. Um, all right, here we are at last. I'm in a different room. I'm in my living room. Uh, and we're talking about Hegel. Uh, in the last lecture, I gave a sprawling, broad overview of Hegelian philosophy uh, and tried to lay out the main ideas of Hegel's dialectic. The dialectic, which is a movement between subject and object, between the inner and the outer. And today, we're going to get into more detail about that dialectic. My broad introduction was meant to correspond to Hegel's preface without going into too many specifics. And so now, today, we're going to look at Hegel's introduction, which is very similar to his preface, and we'll have a chance to review some of those important ideas. And we'll also be looking at sections on consciousness, right? Part A, consciousness. Section 1, sense certainty, or the this and meaning, as well as Part 2, perception, or the thing and deception. So, Hegel's difficult. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about what is difficult about it, and why, at least in my reading of it, I experienced a certain impatience, a different kind of impatience than when reading Kant, for example, or Spinoza. And the impatience was the impatience of agreement. That it seemed to me, rereading this, it's the first time I've reread this in years, that Hegel is describing reality, right? To a much greater extent than Kant or Spinoza. Descartes perhaps falls into that realm also. But Hegel seems to me to be explaining more or less what our intuitive sense of truth and meaning are, without adding a large structure, a large structuration. I mean, there is a large structuration. He's a structural philosopher, just as Kant is. But Hegel's structure, the structure that he describes for reality, is a very subtle one, an open-ended one. It is a movement rather than a static being, a building of a kind, right? A framework, like we find in Kant. So, on the one hand, it seems to me, in a sense, the things that Hegel says are obvious, right? But right, he says them with the greatest amount of depth possible. Many people will say that Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is the most difficult book that exists. Literally, I was just reading this claim the other day. A philosopher was saying, I was reading an introduction to something on Hegel, and the claim was, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel is one of the most difficult philosophers to read, and the Phenomenology of Spirit is the single most difficult book of philosophy. Its difficulty lies in its depth. The ambiguity that Hegel attempts to make clear, the depth of confusion that Hegel delves into. So, as I was saying, on the one hand, Hegel is saying something kind of obvious. He's describing, I think, more or less the way um, a lay person, right? I'm very interested in the distinction between lay and ecclesiastical ideas right now, right? The way a lay person would understand reality. Uh, but he explains that lay reality in uh, extremely complex philosophical terms. So the impatience is in fully agreeing uh, and being impatient with the explanation. But as we'll try and show, the explanation is it's very interesting also, and it's very beautiful. So if we begin with the introduction, um, Hegel begins by saying everything is consciousness. Everything is consciousness. Right? And what he means by this is we never have an experience of anything that isn't a consciousness of something. That consciousness attends our every experience, and we have experience through consciousness. When we're unconscious, we don't have experience. Uh, now, the reason to begin with this observation that everything is consciousness is, I think, in response, or is to make a response to Kant. Right? Kant, who also believes, obviously, that everything is consciousness, everything is structured according to reason. Uh, right? We can only have experience through consciousness, through the a priori ideas of the understanding. Right? So we're familiar with this idea that we don't have immediate access to things in themselves, to use Kant's language. Right? We only have mediated experience. We only have an experience that right, has to go through conditioning of a certain kind, conditioning by reason. Now, Hegel is taking that Kantian insight, right, that all of our experience conforms to our reason, to our consciousness. But he wants to, I think we can think of Hegel's entire project in some sense as, I said this in the last lecture also, as an attempt to de-transcendentalize Kant, to make Kant, right, to give in Kant's system more power to the object itself, the external world, to, right, as it, Hegel's large project, we could say, is if we think of Kant's metaphysics as erecting a kind of skein or a kind of filter, right, like a piece of cheesecloth, uh, vertically, so that all experience, all sense perception, uh, all sensory reception that comes into us has to go through this skein, has to go through this vertical cheesecloth, right? And as it passes through that, it meets the conditions of reason and it becomes understandable. It meets the conditions for the possibility of experience. Uh, for Kant, that conditionality is static. It is, we could think of it as vertical, right? It is a permanent divider and border. Hegel wants to turn that vertical mediator on its side, right? To make it not perfectly horizontal, but instead a kind of incline, right? A grade. So that the conditionality is not a static thing, vertical thing between us and the world uh, that moves with us through time, but rather, right, that mediation, that conditionality, which makes experience possible, is spread out over time, not vertical and static, but in movement. Uh, we, along with the external world, along with the object, are progressing upward together. Uh, that is Hegel's sort of an overhead view of Hegel's response to Kant. But it's of immediate importance in the introduction, which is about, right, cognition and consciousness. So, very first sentence, right, Hegel defines philosophy as defines the proper subject matter of philosophy uh, as knowledge of the absolute, cognition of the absolute. He says actual cognition of what truly is. Subject matter of philosophy is actual cognition of what truly is. Now, what is this actual cognition? Right? What is the nature of cognition? Cognition is right, to cognize is to think, to understand. To cognize something is to grasp it, um, right, to understand it. Um, but right, Hegel's language here is to grasp, to get hold of the absolute. This grasping, this getting hold that is cognition is an important Hegelian metaphor. Uh, when we grasp something, our we grasp it in the manner that we're capable of grasping, right, with our hand. But what we grasp according to the object. Right? I grasp a cup differently than I grasp a door handle, differently than I grasp a shoe or a flower, right? As I look around my apartment. The grasping is grasping toward the absolute, uh, trying to get a hold of it. The fitting uh, of our grasp to the object grasped is the kind of motion of this movement, the way the subject and the object uh, develop together, right, through this conditionality, this dialectical back and forth between them. Cognizing means bringing to reason. Reason, then, is that which cognizes the object. Cognition is reason grasping the object, that mediation. But what is the nature of this grasping? Hegel says either reason is a kind of instrument or it's a kind of uh, mediation. Either we use reason like an instrument in order to grab hold of and pull in, reel in the objects of experience to understand them, which is sort of, roughly an empiricist idea, or else reason is a medium, right? The way that space is a medium for light, perhaps. Or like our cheesecloth example. In either case, Hegel's point is the thing that is grasped by way of something. Experience is not immediately of the object, but, right, experience is the manner by which the object is received, grasped, whether we understand that as a relationship of taking or of being given, right? It's both. So, consciousness, cognition, is always going to shape what is experienced. And this is Hegel being a Kantian. This is the acknowledgement of Kant's premise, right? The acknowledgement of conditionality, and what follows is going to be the sort of revision to Kant. It's not fair to say that Hegel is a revision to Kant. It's an entirely different approach. So, if we acknowledge this, then we experience, as we all have in this class, right, the fear that there is no such thing as truth. That everything is shaped by our consciousness. If we can't have access to the thing as it exists in itself and independently of us, then there must not be truth. Right? So he writes, right, the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science. Right? This is, a problem that continues to haunt us, right? That if truth is relative to human consciousness, if it's relative to reason, if it's relative to our experience, right, then we can't know anything certainly, and we should give up on the idea of truth entirely. Right? What is the sort of gold standard for truth? It would be science, right? Science and mathematics, and and above all, mathematical sciences. So, if we doubt that truth is possible, then we have a mistrust of science. What Hegel wants to do, then, or one of the goals, is to restore faith in truth, restore faith in science, to, again, by explaining the conditional relationship between myself as subject and the external object, right? By explaining it as conditional, as mediated. What Kant does is essentially say, right, everything is in our mind. We can't know what the thing in itself is. We're trapped in our own minds. We're trapped in our own little hermetically sealed bubbles. We can't know anything outside of ourselves, right, which is the ultimate fear that stems from Cartesian philosophy in general. To restore faith in science, then, Hegel wants, again, to change the shape of this conditionality, change the way we understand the nature of this mediation. right? To make it not permanent, but historical, to make it a development, to make it a process of learning, make it a process of realization. Right? So that science can regain our trust and can be known with certainty, uh, with sureness, because that science is going to be based in, right, this dialectical relationship between myself and the other thing, the other world, the external world. Now, by science, right, Hegel doesn't mean necessarily, right, one of the sciences, one of the branches of science, astronomy, say, or physics, or biology. Right? Science for Hegel is a particular kind of knowing. It is the highest truth about the world. So the understanding for Kant is knowledge of the world. Right? The sciences lie only within the realm of understanding. For Hegel, science is going to be that which is capable of pushing us beyond our own understanding, beyond the understanding. I have an understanding of things. Uh, that understanding is common sense to some degree. Right? It conforms to all the categories of reason as Kant describes them. But science does more than provide this basic kind of understanding. Science provides genuine insight into what is, right? Into reality, into being. Uh, so science, because it is insightful into being, into existence, is able to push beyond, right, those that baseline understanding that Kant describes. Now, I'm going to tangent a little bit, but this is important, I think. Um, what's important here, or one of the important things, is to think about this concept of science as that which pushes beyond the understanding uh, in relation to Kant's antinomies. We remember in Kant the use of reason outside the understanding. That is to say, uh, to use reason beyond the established um, categories of experience, to try and reason about prehistoric times, what happened before the Big Bang, or what will happen at the end of the universe, right? To try to understand or experience a basic unit of matter, things like that, right? These are misapplications of reason for Kant. Reason has to remain within the confines of the understanding to reveal truth. So, what Hegel is saying is that science, which is that grasping of reason, is able to, in fact, gain new understanding of what is, and indeed to push beyond the boundaries of the understanding in general. Now, I'm sure there are Kant scholars rolling in their graves or rolling their eyes, but this is one of the key ideas of Hegel. Uh, that the human being, consciousness, is constantly overflowing its own boundaries. It's always surpassing itself. Now, the reason why Kant scholars would be rolling in their graves or set is we can certainly make an argument that Kant understands this, and Kant would say, of course, science is making advancements, right? But they all happen within the sphere of the understanding, right? They all happen with respect to experience, and experience is always already conditioned by the understanding, a priori concepts of understanding. But to that extent, I think Kant is an Hegelian. And there are many ways I think Kant is actually much closer to Hegel than some would say. But in any case, Hegel wants to emphasize this point, right? That reason, science surpasses itself, pushes beyond its own borders. And this is the development of truth, the historical development of truth. Now, the real trick here is in the nature of consciousness. Because, as we said at the beginning, consciousness is everything. Everything is consciousness. I never have an experience of a thing in itself. I only have an experience of a thing for consciousness, a thing of consciousness. So when I am relating to the world, I am relating to some extent, myself, insofar as the world is my consciousness of the world. It is the world for my consciousness. Now, let me take a step back, actually, before jumping into the trickier parts about consciousness. Let's follow Hegel. Let's follow Hegel's argument. Because what Hegel says next is an elaboration on his argument about science. And this, I think, helps us to understand consciousness. Indeed, right? This is the point. Why do we have skepticism about science? What is it that prevents people from being persuaded by science? Hegel says, right, the problem with science, or rather, people's problem with science, is the necessity of appearance. The necessity of the appearance of science. And this is an interesting phrase that Hegel uses repeatedly. When something appears on the scene. He uses this when he's talking about an experience, a perception, when my perception of these flowers appears on the scene. When I perceive for the first time myself as a self-consciousness appears on the scene. So when Hegel says, when science appears on the scene, what he means is the first moment when truth becomes something more than mere appearance. And yet, right? Here is first difficulty, first true Hegelian difficulty. Science itself refers to a truth that is based in appearance, but is more than appearance. But science, as this kind of truth, also appears on the scene, becomes part of experience. The appearance of science is its phenomenology. As we said in the last lecture, the phenomenon is an appearance. So this, right, phenomenology, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, is the investigation into, we could say, Kant's realm of phenomena. And what's key here is that everything has an appearance. It appears in the sense of becoming cognizable, in the sense of appearing to being revealed to consciousness. Everything that is revealed to consciousness is something that appears on the scene. Everything, therefore, has a mere appearance. Even the truth that is based in that which is not appearance. So the trouble with science is that at one level, it's indistinguishable from all other kinds of appearance. I say the earth is flat. You say the earth is round, right? My understanding that the earth is flat is based on appearance, based on what I perceive, right? And therefore, my understanding appears to be a good one. Your understanding that the earth is round is also based, in Hegel's time anyway, on appearance, on observation. But it abstracts away from that observation. It gathers together disparate sets of data, disparate kinds of information, and synthesizes them into an idea that explains all of the appearances more profoundly than the appearances themselves explain themselves. Now, right, so that's the difference between a basic understanding of what Hegel calls natural consciousness, right? The earth is flat, and a kind of scientific consciousness, which is based in appearance but abstracted from it, synthesized, turned into an idea. That second kind is going to be truer than the first kind, right? It is truer that the earth is round or spherical than that the earth is flat. What Hegel means when he says, right, that science appears on the scene is that science appears as a proposition among other propositions. If one has not gone through the work of understanding the science, then one can't differentiate the one proposition from the other. The earth is round, the earth is flat. And when given a choice between these propositions, I will either say, well, my experience conforms to the first one, so I'm going to say the earth is flat. Or I'm going to say, if I listen to your arguments, right, and you tell me, no, I've done the calculations, right, it actually is round. Maybe I believe you, right? Maybe I believe that I shouldn't believe my own experience. However, right, unless I genuinely understand the scientific reasoning that goes into uh, the roundness of the earth, then the two propositions are equivalent, are equal. They're both just propositions. And that fundamental ambiguity, right, the inability to distinguish between two propositions, the truth value of two propositions, it's in that mess, right, that we do our grasping, that we do our true cognizing, that science progresses, and that the individual progresses, right, that we develop. Um, right? So Hegel writes, science, just as it becomes, excuse me, science, just because it comes on the scene, is itself an appearance. Right? In coming on the scene, it is not yet science in its developed and unfolded truth. Science must liberate itself from this semblance, and it can do so only by turning against it, turning against its semblance. For when confronted with a knowledge that is without truth, science can neither merely reject it as an ordinary way of looking at things, while assuring us that its science is a quite different sort of cognition, for which that ordinary knowledge is of no account whatever, nor can it appeal to the vulgar view for the intimations it gives of something better to come. So it's in these moments, right, we lose understanding, where propositions uh, lose the force of truth, uh, that consciousness is able to overleap itself, to pass itself, to develop. And this development is the development of science, the development away from kind of natural consciousness, right? Kind of default mode. So there's one other interesting moment here in this development of science question, which is, what does it mean to reach the truth, to be satisfied by the truth, right? Let's say I think the earth is flat, and you succeed in convincing me that I'm wrong. There's reason to think that the earth is round. I will, right, begin investigating. If I really want to understand, I have to understand the science, right? And so I will look into uh, astronomy, look into geology, right? Whatever science is necessary. But the point is, at some moment, I'm satisfied. I stop searching. That satisfaction is is up to me. It's not up to the object, right? Uh, because what I'm looking for is what I'm looking to do is to satisfy my own reason, my own grasping, right? I will only be satisfied when I have indeed grasped it, right? That is to say, when uh, the the object, the externality, the fact of the shape of the earth, uh, is in fact cognizable to me. When I can explain, for example, how I know that the earth is round. But the requirements for knowing and being satisfied with the knowledge, and being satisfied with the knowledge that the earth is round, are not given by the earth itself. The requirements for satisfaction, those come from me. So, right, the idea is that the limit to truth is set also by consciousness. And that we are satisfied doesn't mean that we have finally and fully grasped the object, but instead that we have a cognition, we have an understanding, truth, capital T, uh, that is sufficient for ourselves. And that sufficiency can always come into question again. That is to say, the question can always be raised anew in some other way, uh, just as we move from atoms to quarks to uh, strings. So, how does science fulfill itself? It does so, right, through the dialectic. Uh, so let's see. Science develops through the dialectic, through consciousness itself, right? Where I move from one consciousness of the world to another consciousness of the world. Now, okay. What's really, right. Why am I not satisfied either when I believe the earth is flat, right? And so what? Someone tells me it's round, what do I care, right? I have a perfectly good understanding of the world when I understand the earth is flat. I'm also not satisfied, right, when uh, I believe that the earth is flat, but I don't understand why, right? That I not only yearn, uh, that I yearn for knowledge. What is this yearning for knowledge? What is the development of consciousness? So, whatever he writes on page 51, hence the progress toward this goal, right? Whatever our goal is also unhalting, and short of it, no satisfaction is to be found at any of the stations on the way. Whatever is confined, whatever is confined within the limits of a natural life cannot by its own efforts go beyond its immediate existence, but it is driven beyond it by something else. And this uprooting entails its death. Okay, so whatever is confined within the limits of a natural life cannot, by its own efforts, go beyond its immediate existence. A biological being cannot go beyond its immediate existence. It is driven beyond it by something else. And this uprooting entails its death. Consciousness, however, is explicitly the notion of itself. Hence, it is something that goes beyond limits. And since these limits are its own, it is something that goes beyond itself. With the positing of a single particular, the beyond is also established for consciousness. Uh, right, so with positing a single particular, the beyond is also established for consciousness. We'll talk about that more when we get to sense certainty. Right, but the idea here is, right, that consciousness is the notion of itself. It is satisfied with itself and unsatisfied with itself. It moves itself. Right? He says, when consciousness, okay, so it moves itself, right? It uproots itself, it destroys itself by moving beyond itself, negating itself. Right? Consciousness is a self destructive and self creating force and movement. Consciousness suffers this violence at its own hands, Hegel writes. It spoils its own limited satisfaction. When we reach satisfaction, right, we can stay with it for a moment. We have a moment of capital T truth. When the world is adequately incorporated into consciousness, when we're satisfied with reason's grasp of the world. But right, it spoils its own limited satisfaction. Consciousness itself, because of what it is, also always goes beyond itself, destroys those capital T truths. When consciousness, Hegel goes on, when consciousness feels this violence, its anxiety may well make it retreat from the truth and strive to hold on to what it is in danger of losing. but it can find no peace. If it wishes to remain in a state of unthinking inertia, then thought troubles its thoughtlessness, and its own unrest disturbs its inertia. Okay, so here's right a little poetic turn for Hegel. It's actually a quite beautifully written text, despite its difficulty. We might fight this consciousness as we fight the consciousness of knowledge that we wish weren't true. We might wish to unknow things. Right? We may try to sink into a kind of thoughtlessness for comfort's sake. But Hegel says, thought troubles this thoughtlessness. Now, whether he's thinking about an individual human being or humanity and history itself, the point is, thought troubles this thoughtlessness. What is the nature, after all, of being a thinking thing? If we go all the way back to Descartes, it is to constantly be bombarded with thoughts, right? To always be troubled by thoughts, to have thoughtlessness always be interrupted by a thought. And these thoughts, thinking, is something that's never satisfied, it's never complete. Right? If thinking were complete, if it were possible to complete thinking, one would hope that we already would have, right? Or that we just would, right? Because the requirements for satisfaction are created by our own consciousness itself. So, because consciousness creates its own requirements for satisfaction, you would think it would be possible to meet those requirements and be satisfied and stop thinking. But no, thinking is that which undercuts its own satisfaction. Thinking is that which negates itself and moves beyond itself, that develops and progresses. To be a thinking thing, then, is to be a thing that is constantly departing from itself, constantly moving away from itself, constantly negating itself. Now, what is the nature of this self-negation, self-surpassing of consciousness? Why does it occur? What does Hegel mean by it? The answer will be found in our, again, relationship to the external world. On page 52, he writes, consciousness simultaneously distinguishes itself from something and at the same time relates itself to it. Or, as it is said, this something exists for consciousness, and the determinate aspect of this relating, or of the being of something for a consciousness, is knowing. But we distinguish this being for another from being in itself. Whatever is related to knowledge or knowing is also distinguished from it, and posited as existing outside of this relationship. This being in itself is called truth. Just what might be involved in these determinations is of no further concern to us here. Now, consciousness distinguishes itself from something. This is interesting already, right? Because everything is consciousness. My consciousness of myself, my consciousness of the table, right? The table is the table of consciousness. When I am conscious of the table, I am conscious of my consciousness of the table, the manner in which I receive the table, that I'm aware of it. My awareness of it is not an awareness of the table in itself, but the table as it is for my consciousness. Consciousness distinguishes itself from something, and at the same time relates itself to it. This something exists for consciousness. And the determinate aspect of this relating, or of this being, is knowing. Whatever it means to be conscious of my consciousness of something, right, is the nature of knowledge. That is to say, what are the things I'm experiencing? That experience is one moment of consciousness, the thing being for consciousness. My consciousness of all these moments of experience is a consciousness of those moments of consciousness. In the immediate consciousness of perception and experience, something is for consciousness. Consciousness for itself. I receive, I perceive, what I perceive is for consciousness. But right, what I experience is an immediate sense impression. In that immediate sense impression, I can only be conscious of the content of that sense impression, the brown of the table. There's nothing else there. That is my consciousness. That is the thing for consciousness, brownness. It's only when I collect all those moments of consciousness, to say brownness mixed with a flat top and four legs, squareness, right? Other characteristics and qualities, properties. When I collect all those moments of perception being for consciousness, I collect them into a consciousness of those consciousnesses, and that consciousness is not for consciousness, but is consciousness in itself. Each moment of experience, each experience of a property, of a sense datum, is a moment of consciousness for itself, where right, consciousness is, as it were, right, as it were, feeling around, right, before grasping. To feel around before grasping. The consciousness of all those moments the sense data, is consciousness in itself, right? It is the grasping, it is having the whole picture. And that is, as Hegel says, truth. So truth is already necessarily mediated and abstract, consciousness of consciousness. He writes on page 53, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Consciousness provides its own criterion from within itself, so that the investigation becomes a comparison of consciousness with itself. For the distinction made above all falls within it. Right? Now, I'm comparing all of my sense data, my receptors, and then I have a consciousness based on that comparison, and that higher consciousness is truth, right? So again, right, I synthesize them all. In consciousness, one thing exists for another, i.e., consciousness regularly contains the determinateness of the moment of knowledge. At the same time, this other is to consciousness not merely for it, but is also outside of this relationship or exists in itself, the moment of truth. Right? So, this higher consciousness is not merely for consciousness, but is in itself. It's right consciousness of consciousness, and that is the truth. Thus, in what consciousness affirms from within itself as being in itself, or the true, we have the standard which consciousness itself sets up, by which to know, to measure what it knows. If we designate knowledge as the notion, but the essence or the true as what exists, or the object, then the examination consists in seeing whether the notion corresponds to the object. The notion, then, is knowledge. The notion is the idea. And I believe actually a better translation of this German word would be idea. I'd have to refer to the German. The notion is knowledge, but the true and the essence is what exists. Now, this is very strange, right? Because the true is the consciousness of consciousness. That is the essence of what exists. Existence and being are consciousness of consciousness in this way. And that's distinct from the notion, which is a matter of knowledge and understanding. The difference is that the true and the essence, while just as founded on consciousness of consciousness as the notion, are also capable of escaping the notion. The true and the essence, what exists, that is to say, right, being as we exist in it, the existence of being for and in us, is the true in essence, the true and the essence. But I think we could say at the level of language and discourse, level of reflection. We have a notion of the true, formalization of that true. And the true existence of the consciousness of consciousness is able to exceed and move beyond that notion. Notion is supplementary. The notion is momentary, developing, but momentary. What makes the notion develop is the movement of the true, the movement of the essence of what is. Now, what Hegel's trying to do is explain how object and subject can have complete interpenetration, as he says in another text, Philosophy of Right. I believe he says it several places. And this complete interpenetration of subject and object implies that consciousness is not merely a tool to grasp what is, but is instead the engine that moves the truth of existence as itself. Thanks, Hassan. It's very late. I had a viewer. This complete interpenetration of subject and object, right? Means that consciousness is the engine that moves existence, and the notion is that which grasps on to a moment of that movement of existence. Right? The word movement is actually derived from the word moment, or is it the other way around? It's the other way around, forgive me. The word moment is actually derived from the word movement. And right, we can see this, right? A moment is only a moment by virtue of being part of a movement. And a movement can only happen through a series of moments. So the movement of consciousness is reflected in the moments of the notion. All right. So, here's, I think, an interesting passage on page 54. For consciousness is, on the one hand, consciousness of the object, and on the other, consciousness of itself. Right? Consciousness is always consciousness of both, external and internal. Consciousness of what for it is the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of the truth. Right? So, the true is existence, existence is moving. Right? that existence is for consciousness. That's the key distinction. Right? The external world is that which is for consciousness. It's not fully external, but that's the meaning of externality. And the notion is the subject, reason, uh, thinking, language, which are only grabbing onto, right? Trying to keep up with this progressive movement of existence. And then he says, since both are for the same consciousness, this consciousness is itself their comparison, right? This is, I think, one of the most difficult things to understand, right? Because what he's positing here is not just this being for consciousness and being in consciousness, but then also a consciousness which is the comparison between the two. It is for this same consciousness to know whether its knowledge of the object corresponds to it or not. I compare my notion to the truth. I compare my understanding to existence. My understanding is consciousness in itself. And my experience of the true of existence is consciousness for itself. True consciousness, the consciousness that does violence to itself, the consciousness that right departs from itself, is this comparing consciousness. Right? It's that comparing consciousness that knows when to depart, when to negate itself, when the notion is no longer sufficient to the truth, and when the truth has shifted, which could be the same thing. How does this consciousness know if it's a comparison between two different kinds of consciousness? How does it make this comparison? And this is Hegel's Cartesian moment. It is for this same consciousness to know whether its knowledge of the object corresponds to the object or not. How does it make this comparison? This is the I think, therefore I am. It does. That's what thinking is. Thinking is the comparison between what one thinks about the world and what one thinks of the world. Right? We can think of a really sort of dumb, easy example. I don't think that that the Loch Ness monster exists. When I think about the world, or what I think of the world, is things like Loch Ness monsters are myths. If I were then to go to Scotland and go to Loch Ness and see the Loch Ness monster, I would have to acknowledge that my worldview is wrong. What I think of the world is wrong, because what I'm seeing about the world, what I'm perceiving about the world, my consciousness for the world consciousness for itself, right? That perception which gives me information has negated my notion. I have to change it. Now, the Loch Ness Monster is obviously a stupid example. But we can think of plenty of much more important examples. Um, so, he writes, if the comparison shows that these two moments do not correspond to one another, it would seem that consciousness must alter its knowledge to make it conform to the object. But in fact, the alteration of knowledge, the object itself alters for it too. For the knowledge that was present was essentially a knowledge of the object. As the knowledge changes, so too does the object, for it essentially belonged to this knowledge. Um, Now, right, this is another important and kind of baffling point. When I change my notion, because it doesn't correspond to the true, what is happening is not just that my idea is changing, but that what is, what exists, has changed. The object has changed, and therefore my notion changes. Hegel insists on this, right? That what we get are new objects, new existences. Now, um, I was thinking about this a while ago in relation to sort of ideology, and thinking about the way that when you believe certain things, the world transforms. And the way that objects and the external world really do morph according to your views, and obviously also vice versa. But that from two different perspectives, you can actually have two different objects. That is to say, two different phenomena in the same phenomena, referring to the same this, the same object, the same here and now. But their meaning and their notion would be totally different. And it's there, again, right, that science becomes so important. Science is that which should be able to mediate between all differences. So that if I believe the Loch Ness Monster exists and you don't, science actually doesn't have a view on that, right? The jury is out because you can't prove a negative. You can't prove that the Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist. You can't prove there isn't a teapot orbiting the Earth, as Bertrand Russell's famous example goes. However, in the debate between flat and round Earth, right, science would have something to say. And so the point of saying that is that opinion is one thing, and opinion is part of what Hegel's thinking about. We can have different opinions, and each opinion reflects a certain truth about a being, about what is. But opinions can always be, right, mediated through a higher truth. And that higher truth itself is not absolute. There is a form of absolute truth, but we'll hopefully come to that at the end. But a scientific truth may not be absolute. It's still reaching. Right? So science, in some sense, merely represents the highest possible opinion for an historical temporal period. All right. Well, we're at 121 here, time-wise, so we're going to stop before we even get into sense certainty of perception. But actually, in going through the introduction, we covered a lot of the sense certainty and perception material. Um, you know, we'll go over the language in those chapters in a little bit more detail. Next lecture, next class. All right. Until then.